August 1944. France burns under Allied boots. While Eisenhower coordinates the careful chess game of liberating Europe, one general refuses to play by the rules. George S. Patton Jr. Ego wrapped in armor, genius dipped in gasoline, is tearing across France at speeds the world has never seen. His Third Army moves so fast, supply lines snap like rubber bands. Fuel depots run dry. Command screams for him to stop, but Patton won't. He can't. Because in his mind, hesitation kills more men than bullets. And that belief, that hunger for glory, nearly destroyed him. The hedgerows of Normandy had become a graveyard. For 6 brutal weeks after D-Day, American forces bled through the bocage, ancient earthen walls topped with tangled brush that turned every field into a fortress, every lane into a kill zone. Tanks were ambushed. Infantry was slaughtered. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. The Wehrmacht, battered but disciplined, made the Allies pay for every inch of French soil. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, over 1,500 American bombers turned a 5-mile stretch of German lines into a moonscape. 3,000 tons of high explosives shattered divisions, pulverized equipment, and broke the spine of the German defense. Within days, American armor punched through. The bocage gave way to open countryside, rolling fields, clear roads, and suddenly the war changed. On August 1, 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. officially activated the U.S. Third Army. His orders were simple: protect General Omar Bradley's southern flank, secure the ports of Brittany, St. Malo, Brest, Lorient, link up with Allied forces pushing east. Standard operational procedure: methodical, safe. Patton had other ideas. He stood before his men in a tailored uniform, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming on his hips, and spoke in language that would have made a sergeant blush. Speed, he told them, was violence. Aggression was survival. Hesitation was death. To Patton, war wasn't a chessboard, it was a cavalry charge, and he intended to lead it. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower preferred caution, consolidation, logistics. He wanted the ports secured, supply lines stabilized, and a measured advance into France. But Patton saw what others didn't or refused to see. The German army wasn't retreating, it was disintegrating. Entire divisions were scattered, leaderless, out of fuel, and low on ammunition. Roads lay open. Bridges stood intact. And beyond the chaos, 300 miles to the east, sat Paris, the heart of occupied Europe. Patton didn't wait for permission. He took initiative. Within days, Third Army columns were racing southeast at speeds that defied doctrine. 30 miles a day, 40, sometimes 50. Sherman tanks roared down French highways while infantry rode atop half-tracks, capturing towns before German commanders even knew they were surrounded. Patton's advance wasn't methodical, it was a stampede. A mechanized blitzkrieg turned against its creators. Entire enemy divisions were bypassed, cut off, left to wither. Fuel depots were seized before they could be destroyed. Bridges were captured intact. In 2 weeks, Patton's Third Army covered more ground than Napoleon's Grande Armée had crossed in a month during the 1812 invasion of Russia. But speed had a cost. Supply lines stretched thin. Gasoline trucks raced to keep up. The infantry struggled to consolidate gains. And ahead, deeper into France, the Wehrmacht began to regroup. Patton's iron flood was about to hit a wall, and the reckoning would come faster than anyone expected. Victory has a price, and in August 1944, that price was measured in gasoline. George Patton's Third Army was devouring France at a pace no supply officer had ever planned for. His tanks didn't crawl, they sprinted. Sherman tanks, the backbone of his armored divisions, gulped fuel at a brutal rate, 1 gallon per mile. Multiply that by thousands of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, reconnaissance cars, and the numbers became staggering. 400,000 gallons of gasoline, every single day. The fuel had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was over 400 miles away, back at the Normandy beaches where the Allies had landed 2 months earlier. The deep-water ports Patton was supposed to capture, Brest, St. Malo, Lorient, were still in German hands or wrecked beyond use. Cherbourg, the only functioning port, was still being cleared of mines and rubble. Everything Patton needed had to be hauled overland, through bombed villages and shattered roads, by truck. Enter the Red Ball Express. Named after railroad terminology for priority freight, the Red Ball Express became the lifeline of Patton's advance. Starting on August 25th, convoys of trucks rolled day and night along a one-way loop stretching from the coast to the front. Over 6,000 vehicles, 23,000 drivers, most of them African-American soldiers from segregated quartermaster and transportation units. They drove 10-ton trucks loaded with ammunition, rations, and above all, fuel. The work was relentless. Drivers stayed behind the wheel for 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours straight. They fought exhaustion on narrow roads cratered by artillery. Brakes failed on mountain descents. Tires blew. Trucks overturned. Men fell asleep and careened into ditches or worse, into oncoming convoys. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, cannibalizing broken vehicles to keep others running. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,000 tons of supplies per day. But it wasn't enough. By mid-August, Patton's divisions were grinding to a halt, not because the Wehrmacht had stopped them, but because their tanks were empty. Columns sat idle on French roadsides, crews staring at fuel gauges hovering near zero. Patton's fury was volcanic. He screamed at staff officers. He demanded priority. He accused headquarters of cowardice, of timidity, of betrayal. And then he took matters into his own hands. Patton began diverting fuel shipments meant for Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army to the north. He sent officers to supply depots with forged requisition orders. He lied to Eisenhower's headquarters about his fuel status, underreporting what he had and exaggerating what he needed. His reconnaissance units became thieves, quietly borrowing stockpiles assigned to other commands. When questioned, Patton shrugged. "Better to beg forgiveness than ask permission," he said. "Audacity shortens wars. Caution prolongs them." Eisenhower's staff knew exactly what Patton was doing. Reports flooded in, complaints piled up, but they faced an impossible truth: Patton was winning. Towns fell daily. German prisoners flooded in by the thousands. The Third Army's star was rising, and stopping it now would be political suicide. So they let him run, let him steal, let him lie. Until the day he pushed too far, and the Germans pushed back. August 1944, France was burning, and George Patton was the flame. His Third Army tore eastward like a force of nature. Town after town fell in rapid succession. Laval, Le Mans, Chartres, ancient cities that had endured centuries of war, now watched American tanks rumble through their cobblestone streets in mere hours. The German retreat wasn't organized, it was panic. Supply columns abandoned their vehicles. Officers fled without their men. Entire units dissolved into the countryside, discarding helmets and rifles, desperate to escape the American juggernaut. Adolf Hitler, enraged by the collapse, ordered counterattacks. Operation Liudich was launched on August 7th near Mortain, a desperate armored thrust aimed at cutting Patton's supply lines and trapping his forces. 4 panzer divisions smashed into American positions in the pre-dawn darkness. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Allied air power arrived. Typhoons and thunderbolts descended in waves, turning German tanks into burning coffins. Within 48 hours, Liudich had failed. Hitler's gamble cost him divisions he couldn't replace. Patton's advance continued uninterrupted. On August 19th, units from Major General Manton Eddy's XII Corps reached the Seine River, over 100 miles east of Normandy, days ahead of schedule, and far beyond where Supreme Headquarters had expected them. Patton's tankers stared across the wide, sluggish river, and some couldn't believe how far they'd come. Behind them lay a trail of liberated villages, shattered enemy formations, and supply officers pulling their hair out in despair. But Patton didn't celebrate, he seethed. Because Paris lay just 30 miles north. The Rhine River, Germany's western border, was within reach. Berlin itself felt close enough to taste, and yet Eisenhower's headquarters was telling him to slow down. Worse, they were giving priority supplies and strategic objectives to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north. Patton despised Montgomery. He saw him as cautious, methodical, overcautious, a man who studied maps while Patton conquered ground. Montgomery's careful advances contrasted sharply with Patton's blitzkrieg pace, and the American general made no secret of his contempt. In his mind, the war could be over by Christmas if commanders would just get out of his way. Back at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley weren't celebrating either. They were panicking. Patton's unauthorized advances had created a dangerous bulge in the Allied front. His flanks were exposed. His supply lines stretched like a taut wire across hundreds of miles, and he'd completely ignored orders to consolidate forces and secure the Breton ports, the mission he was actually assigned. Intelligence reports were alarming. Wehrmacht forces were regrouping in the east. Fuel depots were running dry. If the Germans counterattacked and Patton's tanks were immobilized, thousands of Americans could be surrounded and destroyed. Even Patton's own staff, officers who idolized him, who'd follow him into hell, were terrified. They knew the math. 400 miles from the nearest port, 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. Every mile forward meant another mile the supply trucks had to travel. The logistics were unsustainable. One major German counteroffensive, and the Third Army would be fighting for survival. On August 28, Eisenhower issued a direct, unambiguous order: stop, consolidate, secure your lines, wait for supplies. Patton read the message, crumpled it in his fist, and ordered his columns to keep moving. Early September 1944. For the first time since Normandy, George Patton's Third Army stopped moving. Not because the Germans had stopped them, not because of casualties or battle damage. The reason was simpler and far more humiliating: they were out of gas. Patton's spearhead sat frozen on the rolling hills of eastern France, within sight of Metz and Nancy, ancient fortress cities guarding the German border. His tanks were parked on roadsides, their engines silent. Crews sat idle, smoking cigarettes, staring eastward at a prize they could almost touch. The Rhine River, the gateway into Germany itself, lay less than 50 miles away, and they couldn't move an inch. Patton was apoplectic. In his private diary, he unleashed a torrent of rage. He accused Eisenhower of cowardice. He called the Supreme Commander a puppet of British interests. He blamed Field Marshal Montgomery for hoarding supplies. He railed against supply officers, politicians, and anyone else who stood between him and Berlin. To Patton, the war could have been over by Christmas. Instead, it was being strangled by bureaucrats and timid generals who couldn't see what he saw: a broken enemy, ripe for the killing blow. On September 2nd, Patton demanded a face-to-face meeting with Eisenhower. When they met, Patton didn't mince words. He wanted priority fuel allocation. He wanted Montgomery's supplies diverted to the Third Army. He wanted permission to drive straight into Germany and end the war. Eisenhower refused. The Supreme Commander had already committed resources to Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's audacious plan to drop 3 airborne divisions into the Netherlands, seize a series of bridges, and punch a corridor into Germany's industrial heartland. It was bold. It was risky. And it demanded everything the Allies had. There was nothing left for Patton. Patton exploded. He shouted. He cursed. He accused Eisenhower of letting politics dictate strategy, of sacrificing American lives to appease the British. At one point, witnesses claimed Patton threatened to resign. Eisenhower, normally unflappable, stood firm. The decision was final. Behind closed doors at Supreme Headquarters, senior staff officers began whispering the unthinkable, relieving Patton of command. Some even floated the possibility of a court-martial. Not for tactical failure, Patton's battlefield record was untouchable, but for insubordination, for stealing fuel from Allied units, for endangering the unity of the Allied coalition, for flagrant disobedience of direct orders. General Omar Bradley intervened. Firing Patton, he argued, would demoralize American troops who saw him as a hero. It would hand the Germans a propaganda victory, proof that the Allies were fractured. And worst of all, it would confirm to the world that brilliance could be punished for inconvenience. Patton kept his command, barely. But history has never settled the question that haunts this moment. Was Patton right? If his fuel allocation had been prioritized over Montgomery's, could the Third Army have smashed through the Siegfried Line and ended the war in 1944? Could thousands of lives have been saved? Or would Patton's overextended forces have been encircled and destroyed, handing Hitler a catastrophic victory? The debate rages on, but one truth is undeniable: disobedience in wartime isn't just risky, it's mutiny. And mutiny, even when wrapped in genius, carries consequences. Patton kept his command, but the price of his gamble was already being paid, in blood, in the cold autumn rain, in the killing fields of Lorraine. September 1944, the lightning war was over. George Patton's Third Army, once a roaring tide of tanks and triumph, now sat mired in the mud and blood of eastern France. The open roads were gone. The fleeing enemy had vanished. In their place, fortified positions, flooded fields, and ancient stone fortresses that had withstood sieges for centuries. Welcome to Lorraine. The landscape was a nightmare. Autumn rains turned the rolling countryside into a swamp, foxholes filled with freezing water, tanks bogged down in knee-deep mud, roads dissolved into impassable muck, and at the center of it all stood Metz, a fortress city bristling with 19th-century forts built by the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War, thick walls, interlocking fields of fire, underground tunnels and bunkers designed to withstand artillery barrages. Patton ordered his men to take it. The fighting was savage. The 5th Infantry Division assaulted Fort Driant in late September, climbing rain-slicked slopes under machine gun fire. They breached the outer walls, only to find themselves trapped in subterranean tunnels filled with German defenders. Flamethrowers roared in the darkness. Grenades exploded in confined spaces. Men suffocated from smoke and cordite. After a week of brutal close-quarters combat, the Americans withdrew, leaving behind over 600 casualties. It was the first time Patton's Third Army had retreated. But Patton wouldn't accept failure. His pride, his reputation, his entire philosophy of war demanded that Metz fall. He threw division after division at the city's defenses. The 90th Infantry Division, the 95th, the 10th Armored, artillery pounded German positions day and night. Bombers turned sections of the city into rubble, and still the Germans held. This wasn't the war Patton knew. There was no speed here, no maneuver, no audacity, just attrition, trench warfare. The grinding, soul-crushing brutality his father's generation had endured at Verdun and the Somme. Everything Patton despised, he was now commanding. Casualties mounted with sickening inevitability. 50,000 men, killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated for trench foot and frostbite. Some companies lost 80% of their strength. Replacements arrived straight from stateside training camps, boys who'd never seen combat and were dead within days. Medics worked around the clock in aid stations overflowing with shattered bodies. Letters home described exhaustion beyond measure. Soldiers wrote of sleeping in frozen mud, of watching friends bleed out in minefields, of artillery barrages that never seemed to end. One infantry sergeant wrote that Lorraine felt less like a battle and more like an execution. Patton himself grew quieter. The fiery speeches stopped. The bravado dimmed. In private moments he stared at maps with hollow eyes. He knew the truth and his pride wouldn't let him say aloud. He had gambled and he had lost. The fast advance that could have ended the war had instead bled his army dry. Metz finally fell on November 22nd, but the victory felt hollow. Tens of thousands of casualties for a city that might have been bypassed entirely. And then on December 16, 1944, everything changed. German forces erupted from the Ardennes forest in a massive surprise offensive. Over 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and a desperate gamble by Adolf Hitler to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Within hours, American forces were in full retreat, divisions shattered, command posts overrun, panic spread through Allied headquarters. And suddenly, every general who had criticized Patton, every staff officer who had called him reckless, every politician who had demanded his court-martial, they all went silent. Because the man who nearly destroyed his career with reckless speed was about to save the Allied cause with a miracle. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest erupted in fire and steel. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, smashed through thinly defended American lines in Belgium. The attack was a total surprise. Command posts were overrun. Communications collapsed. Entire regiments retreated in chaos. Within days, German panzers had carved a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied territory, threatening to split the American and British armies in two. At Supreme Headquarters, panic set in. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. Commanders sat around a table, faces grim, maps covered in red arrows showing German advances. The room was tense, silent. Then Patton walked in. Eisenhower asked how quickly the Third Army could disengage from Lorraine, pivot 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the German flank. Most generals would have asked for a week, 2 weeks, time to plan, reorganize, resupply. Patton said 48 hours. The room went silent. Some thought he was joking. Others thought he was insane. Moving an entire army, over 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks across icy winter roads in the middle of a battle under enemy fire with minimal preparation. It was logistically impossible. Patton had already issued the orders. Within 2 days, the Third Army executed one of the most stunning maneuvers in military history. The 4th Armored Division raced north through blizzards and blackouts. Engineers cleared roads. Supply convoys worked through the night. Units that had been fighting in Lorraine suddenly found themselves barreling toward Belgium. On December 22nd, Patton's forces slammed into the southern flank of the German salient near Bastogne, where the surrounded 101st Airborne Division was making a desperate stand. The fighting was brutal. Tanks dueled in snowstorms. Infantry attacked through frozen forests, but Patton's momentum was unstoppable. On December 26th, the 4th Armored broke through German lines and linked up with the defenders at Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The German offensive stalled. By January, Hitler's last great gamble in the West had failed. The same reckless audacity that nearly destroyed Patton's career had just saved the Allied cause. And therein lies the paradox of George S. Patton. His hunger for glory was insatiable. His contempt for caution bordered on insubordination. His refusal to obey orders endangered lives and strained alliances. These traits nearly got him court-martialed in September, but in December they made him irreplaceable. The very characteristics that made him a problem child also made him a battlefield genius. Historians still debate his August rampage across France. Some call it visionary, a chance to end the war months early, squandered by timid superiors. Others call it criminal negligence, a reckless gamble that bled his army and accomplished nothing strategic. Eisenhower himself, in his post-war memoirs, described Patton as brilliant, indispensable, and utterly impossible to control. George Patton never got his parade through Berlin. He never stood in Hitler's bunker. He never saw the final victory he craved. On December 9, 1945, less than 8 months after Germany's surrender, Patton died in a car accident on an icy road near Mannheim, Germany. Not in combat, not leading a charge, just a freak collision that broke his neck. but his legacy endures. The Third Army's dash across France remains legend, 400 miles in 30 days, a feat unmatched in modern warfare. It stands as a testament to the razor's edge between genius and madness, between triumph and disaster, between following orders and making history. George Patton almost threw away his career for 400 miles of French road, but in doing so, he proved something the textbooks couldn't teach: that wars aren't won by those who follow orders. They're won by those willing to break them.